was getting these stories from these people saying that they had tried everything, and then finally methylene blue was like the only thing that got them back to work, that got their pain better. That's one of the major things that people will feel when they first start methylene blue is
Dr. Scott Sherr is a health optimization expert known for using methylene blue, hyperbaric oxygen, and psychedelics to boost brain function, energy, and overall performance.
A lot of the modern day diseases we know of today that are killing us, whether it's cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, have some form of mitochondrial dysfunction. How many people currently have mitochondrial dysfunction?
About 94% of the United States population. Only 6% of the United States population is metabolically healthy. The beautiful thing about methylene blue is that it can compensate for any dysfunction in the mitochondria itself. It can improve mitochondrial efficiency, not only from the energy production side of things, but also from the detoxification side.
Not all synthetic chemicals are bad, and not all natural chemicals are good.
It's a really important point. What's amazing about methylene blue is just sort of the overall spectrum of how it can really help in the cells and the mitochondria itself.
Methylene blue reduces amyloid beta levels and rescues early cognitive deficit by increasing proteasome activity.
It's actually been shown in stroke, in traumatic brain injury, that you can rescue brain tissue by...
Scott, I'm so excited to get into this with you because so many people right now, I don't know if you've noticed, you probably have, on social media, are walking around with these blue tongues and blue mouths. It kind of reminds me of these blue things I used to suck on when I was about 5 years old, but I'm guessing that the composition and structure of what I was ingesting back then is completely different. But we are, of course, talking about methylene blue. And I want to first start with when I first heard about methylene blue. And my primary area of research is Alzheimer's disease. And I think it was around 5 years ago I came across a study, and you've probably seen it. It was a 2011 study published in Brain Pathology. Methylene blue reduces amyloid beta levels and rescues early cognitive deficit by increasing proteasome activity. And the conclusions were very promising. They basically found that methylene blue was able to decompress and basically get rid of the amyloid depositions that build up in the brain in these cognitive impairment patients. So we're going to be speaking about all of that. And I first want to start with a definition of what exactly is methylene blue.
Well, thank you for having me, Louisa. This is exciting to kind of really dive into the neurocognitive side of methylene blue, like in real detail. So I haven't done that in a podcast yet, but I've been really excited about it. I've known about methylene blue for a long time. And if you look at the research or anybody looks at just the history, methylene blue has been around since the 1870s. Okay, so it's been around a long, long time. It was the first drug that was registered with our FDA in the United States in 1897. So, and the actual indication at that point was for malaria. And it really was between 1897 and the 1950s, the only antimicrobial around. Before penicillin and other drugs that derived from penicillin came out in the 1950s. So methylene blue was as an antifungal, was an antimicrobial, antiviral. And this may have something to do with those amyloid plaques that you're talking about too, right? As we think this might be reactive to potential infection in some people, in some groups of Alzheimer's patients. And I'm sure we can dig into all of that. But really the first sort of epoch, or the chapter, as you call it, for methylene blue was as directly and primarily as an antimicrobial. The second epoch or chapter really is that it was found to have all these potential so let's call them psychotropic properties, because methylene blue is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which means it blocks the degradation of norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. So it increases these neurotransmitters in the brain. And the first antipsychotics were actually derived from methylene blue back in the 1950s and 60s, and then from there. The sort of third chapter of methylene blue as a stain in biochemistry. So if you were in chemistry lab, even when I was in college back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, methylene blue is still used as a stain. It actually concentrates in a part of your cell called your mitochondria, which is obviously extremely important. This is where it really does all of its magic. And that's sort of like am I on the fourth chapter now, or fifth chapter of methylene blue? The real sort of key where methylene blue works, and as you're seeing all the popularity of it over the last several years, You ran into it a while ago. We started using it. We were the first company to have a commercial product with it in 2020, before anybody really knew what methylene blue was. The real key was how it was working and how it continues to work in the mitochondria of the cells, the powerhouse, the energy producing factories of our cells, and do it in such a comprehensive way. But in essence, to answer your question, methylene blue initially was a textile dye that dyed things very blue. And in
For
that
jeans,
case,
right?
the first thing that it was able to dye was actually, it was dyeing textiles, blue jeans blue. And so like if you had blue jeans back in the 1870s, that's why your blue jeans were blue. But it's a synthetic ingredient. Doesn't come from the earth, the ground, and that's important for people to realize. So not everything that's synthetic is bad for you. Not everything from the ground is good for you, obviously.
I can't believe you just said that. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No,
I
please.
just put up an Instagram post this morning, literally saying that. Not all chemicals are made the same, and we need to stop demonizing the word chemicals, because literally everything is chemicals. Water are chemicals. We are chemicals. Oxygen is a chemical.
Yes.
And not all synthetic chemicals are bad, and not all natural chemicals are good.
It's a really important point, right? And I'm an internal medicine physician. I trained in hospitals. I saw people die foraging for the wrong mushrooms and die of liver failure in terrible, terrible situations. So not everything that comes from the ground is good, and not everything from a lab is bad. And we live in a synthetic world now, especially with everything that's going on with our light, with our water, with our food, et cetera. And so having things that are synthetic can be very, very helpful in some cases. And what's amazing about methylene blue is just sort of the overall spectrum of how it can really help in the cells and the mitochondria itself.
All right, there is so much to decompress right now, and I want to first start off with the psychoactive part that you mentioned. And now we're talking about neurotransmitters. And for everybody listening, these are just chemicals that are released in the brain. And a lot of people know of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is also a neuromodulator, important for vigilance and drive and motivation. And then we've got the serotonin, the quote unquote, the happy chemical. So they're released at the synaptic cleft when two neurons pretty much synapse together and they meet. Now, my question is, does it increase the capacity for one neuron to release more dopamine? Or, for example, if we're talking about dopamine or norepinephrine, or does it increase the amount of time that these chemicals are in our bloodstream and in the brain?
So it's the latter. So what a monoamine oxidase inhibitor does in general is it prevents the breakdown of these neurotransmitters. So it prevents the breakdown of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine.
So when it's released, instead of them breaking down, they stay in there longer.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's one of the major things that people will feel when they first start methylene blue is a boost in your mood. People will typically start feeling a little brighter. Their motivation will be a little bit greater. And it's been studied actually in multiple different contexts in the mental health world. There are studies in bipolar, in depression, for example, and seeing that methylene blue, even as a monotherapy, as a singular compound used, can be very helpful in these cases. And I think part of this is related to the neurotransmitter ecosystem that's changing, that's for sure. But we also know that a lot of mental health disorders, especially bipolar, which is pretty well described, there's a significant amount of mitochondrial dysfunction as well that's ongoing that I think methylene blue is having a potential impact on as well.
So if we go really molecular, at the site of this, the root of this is it's improving mitochondrial efficiency.
Right. And it does it in about, there's so many different ways that it does this. We can go through all of them in significant detail if you'd like. But I think it's always good to give the context here of, there are so many mitochondria in our brain. We sometimes, when I was in 7th grade, and I'm sure you were even in Australia, you learn that a cell has a nucleus, it has cytoplasm, it has a mitochondria, it has Golgi bodies, as endoplasmic reticulum. It's a cell membrane, which is really the brain of the cell, to be honest. So you get this picture of this one mitochondria in the cell, but that's actually not how it works. There are some cells in our body that have thousands of mitochondria per cell, and there's other cells in our body that have 1 or even 0. So our red blood cells, for example, have 0 mitochondria. They used to have mitochondria, but when they get bigger and they get more mature, they actually release their mitochondria. And so there's more room to carry oxygen on your red blood cells. So the places where we have the most mitochondria per cell, our brain is actually number 2. Number 1 is actually ovaries and sperm. So to make a baby requires a lot of energy. So our sperm and our eggs specifically have tons of mitochondria per cell. And so you have your gonads, as we call them, your sperm and your eggs, and you have your brain, your heart, your liver. Your musculoskeletal tissue has the most mitochondria per cell in reserve so that you can run away from something that's chasing you if you needed to do that, for example. So why does the mitochondria start breaking down? Well, I guess before you get there, like what happens when the mitochondria don't work in those places, right? So if we can't, have a baby, infertility rates or fertility rates themselves are really, really an issue these days and getting worse. Brain function in all the ways that we'll describe, I'm sure today, is significantly degrading for anything from, memory to recall to cognitive impairment from an executive function perspective, from brain fog and fatigue and those kinds of things, and cardiac issues, liver issues, exercise-induced fatigue. So why is all this happening? Because the mitochondria aren't working very well. And there's about 5 or so things that are really the reason for that. There's multiple different things within these categories. The main cause of mitochondrial dysfunction is insulin resistance. So if you have too high of a blood sugar on a regular basis, your mitochondria are not going to be very happy and they're not going to work very well. Toxins in our environment, everything from the food to the water to the light to the EMFs and everything else, these are also causing significant impact on our mitochondria. Infections are causing significant issues on our mitochondria. So this could be a viral infection. This could also be a post-viral issue, like you've had COVID, for example, and you still can't move. Your brain doesn't work. This is a mitochondrial issue as well. And then you have medications that also cause mitochondrial dysfunction as well. So you have toxins, you have insulin resistance, you have medications, you have infections. You have so many different things that are affecting sort of this common denominator, which is your mitochondria, which is really important, obviously, for you to be making energy. And that's why we have so many issues with symptomatology, as I described.
Yeah, and it's actually, do you know the statistics of how many people currently have, in the US alone, have mitochondrial dysfunction?
What I've read and what we're looking at here is about 94% of the United States population. So only 6% of the United States population is metabolically healthy. And what I mean by metabolically healthy is that people can take in the food that they eat, make energy efficiently from the food that we intake, and then also are able to detox or to regulate the processes that are involved when we make energy. So just like if you are a car, you need gasoline for a car, say. There is waste products that come from the gasoline itself. There are quote unquote waste products from energy generation in our cells. So we make energy, something called ATP. We make carbon dioxide, which we breathe off mostly. And then we have water. And then we have also these other things called ROS, reactive oxygen species. And so some of these in small amounts are very important for signaling, but in large amounts, they can cause significant stress on the system and cause deterioration. And this is a major issue that we see across the spectrum of health, and so much more we can do to help people. And what's super amazing about Methylene Blue is that it can improve mitochondrial efficiency, not only from the energy production side of things, but also from the detoxification side as well.
And the repair side, obviously.
So the detox side is what I mean by repair side, in the sense that if you have too much reactive oxygen species, the system starts breaking down in various ways. And what Methylene Blue can do is it can act directly as an antioxidant. And as a result of that, it can neutralize some of that stress, that ROS that can build up over time, especially if we're chronically sick and chronically inflamed and have chronic complex medical issues. Like, you're going to deplete your capacity to have enough antioxidant capacity itself to neutralize the effects of making energy, which breaks the whole cycle down.
I wonder, can you actually measure mitochondrial health in certain organs in the body?
That's a really good question. And there's a lot of companies that are looking into this now. There's a couple of companies out there. I have a number of longevity docs that I collaborate with and colleagues, and none of us are really convinced that any of those tests are really worth the money quite yet. The only really good test is a punch biopsy, which is when you actually take a sample of tissue from somebody and you actually look at it under a microscope and you see what's happening. But that's still very, very difficult to do.
Very invasive.
There's some bioenergetic testing that you can do, which is kind of with other types of modalities. The way I usually look at mitochondrial efficiency is by looking at something called organic acid testing. Organic acid testing is used a lot in the sort of, let's call it the functional integrative space, where I play in. I have a clinical practice. It's something called health optimization medicine. And that's kind of the birth of my interest and the interest in our companies in Methylene Blue, in ways to help people right now while they're on the longer path of optimizing their health. But when it comes to mitochondrial function, you can measure your macronutrients, your proteins, your carbs, your fats. You can measure how well they break down in the system. You can measure intermediates in what's called the citric acid cycle. So the cycle of in the mitochondria that is really designed to peel off electrons from your food and then bring them into your electron transport chain in the mitochondria, which is where we create this gradient of protons and electron flow and allow energy to be made that way. So you can measure many of those steps along the way. You can also measure detox capacity. So you can measure your level of antioxidants, basically indirectly by looking at how stressed the system is. So in my clinical practice, I'm looking at all these inputs and these outputs of mitochondrial efficiency, as it were. But I'm looking at their indirect measurements compared to actually looking at what a mitochondria is doing right now. But those measurements are coming, and I just got another email again yesterday from another company saying, "Hey, we have another mitochondrial test to take a look at." So I'll cross my fingers before I say that that's going to happen and it'd be good, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think that there is so much promise for so many areas in medicine. Like, let's just take fertility, for example, because you mentioned that the most concentrated mitochondria are in the ovaries. And it's always fascinating to me. I probably bring it up in almost every podcast because I think it's the only area of medicine where sometimes you just have to rely on luck. And that's always so hard for me to understand. What was hard for me to really understand was how you could get, a 28-year-old female, maybe with a high egg count as measured by an AMH, who just cannot seem to fall pregnant. But then you get this really super healthy, because I've had a patient before and we optimized the absolute crap out of her. And she's 43 and she probably going into perimenopause at that stage, and we optimized her hormones, her mitochondria. Like, she was such a healthy female, and she fell pregnant by accident, not trying, not even wanting to conceive at the age of 43, with also a low AMH as well. And I was, when she told me, I was baffled. But now that I understand more about it, I'm like, wow, your egg, whatever it was, however many there were, whether there was one, because it just takes one egg to make a baby, must have been so strong and so mighty that just happened. Do you think that this would have promise?
Her anatomy lessons from health class.
She evidently forgot, yes, because obviously there's a 5 or 6 day window in there. However, it does make me think that a lot of the modern day diseases, and of course we're going to hone in on Alzheimer's disease, but a lot of the diseases that we know of today that are killing us, whether it's cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, have some form of mitochondrial dysfunction attached to it, even at the root of most of these diseases.
Exactly. And I'm actually very interested in the fertility side because of what we're seeing as a mitochondrial efficiency aspect using Methylene Blue. So I'm working with a few fertility providers right now to look if we can actually at least measure AMHs before and after a month of Methylene Blue to see if there is a significant impact on the AMH at least.
I thought AMH doesn't change though.
Yeah, it does change. Actually, it can change. Yeah, it does change. You can see an AMH rise and change. It's going to fall as you get older, of course, right? Your AMH is going to change because your egg viability is going to go down. But it can go up too. They have been looking at another drug called rapamycin, for example, that's showing promise as well as it increasing things like AMH. So that's happening, but it's still early days with that kind of thing. As far as can you reverse egg age and how you can measure that over time, how you can look at follicles with ultrasound and things like that. But so I have interest in that.
Today's episode is sponsored by Momentous, the highest quality supplement company on the market, period. You know me. I don't trust most supplement companies, and for good reason. Studies show that up to 40% of supplements contain contaminants, mislabeling, or intentional alterations. But Momentous is different. I spent years vetting their products and leadership team before partnering with them in 2021. Every Momentous product is third-party tested, and many are NSF certified for sport, ensuring purity, potency, and safety. The three I use most are omega-3s for brain health, creatine for muscle and cognitive support, and their newly improved whey protein for lean muscle mass. They are what I call my top tier supplements, tier 1, that every single person should be having every single day. These are some of the most well-researched, effective supplements available. If you want to try Momentous, go to livemomentous.com and use code NEURO at checkout for 20% off all products. Guys, I'm serious. If you really want a clean, non-rancid omega-3 fatty acid, EPA and DHA, head on over to livemomentous.com/neuro or just put neuro into checkout for 20% off. All right, I want to hone in now on the brain. And you mentioned earlier that methylene blue can act as an antimicrobial peptide, as we saw in the 1800s with malaria cases. Now, amyloid, Alzheimer's disease used to be called the amyloid cascade hypothesis. What we know now, we've been demonizing amyloid, which is a peptide, but we now know that it is an antimicrobial peptide, meaning that when we are, let's just say we are stressed and we activate our innate immune system, our brain is pretty much saying, whoa, Louisa's under stress, let's raise amyloid, which comes up as a shield to protect the neurons. And it occurs outside of the neurons in the cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. And it basically shields the brain against the threat that is coming to you, that you have posed upon your system. And what happens is when we don't have a good functioning brain and we are not sleeping properly, we don't get to clear out the amyloid, and they tend to accumulate. So if this methylene blue is also an antimicrobial peptide, what does that mean in terms of fighting the amyloid depositions themselves?
Right. So, I mean, I guess first, just to clarify, methylene blue is not a peptide itself.
It's not a peptide, no,
yeah,
sorry.
It's a compound that can potentially address the amyloid peptide as you're describing. But what I would say here is that, the research is very early on here to understand exactly how methylene blue is causing an increase in clearance of the amyloid itself. There's probably a number of different ways that this is happening. I think the first way that is interesting but not as well understood is the antimicrobial aspect of it that you just described. So we know that higher doses of methylene blue, around 1 milligram per kilogram, which is around 70 or 80 milligrams in an individual, or higher, are significantly antimicrobial, which means that the way they work is that they create a increase in the amount of reactive oxygen species in the system, and they actually create something called hydrogen peroxide. And so hydrogen peroxide is something that our cells make to fight all different types of things. Hydrogen peroxide is used to cause autophagy or mitophagy, so actually killing our own cells if they're not needed anymore. And this is something that's naturally happening all the time. But hydrogen peroxide is also used as an anti-infective. And that's what's interesting also about methylene blue, is that it's never been shown to have any resistance patterns against any the microbes that it works against. So that typically if you take an antibiotic, it's going to stop working over time because the bacteria in this case would find resistance to that particular antibiotic and find ways around actually being treated with that particular antibiotic. But methylene blue has never shown any resistance patterns because it increases the body's production of hydrogen peroxide. There's also some evidence that it increases the capacity, as I mentioned, to increase lysosome production, and then as a result of that, increase the production of other factors that allow the cells to die if they should need to die. So this is mitophagy and autophagy. So autophagy is when the cells actually kill themselves in the process of trying to save tissue around them or cells around them and that kind of thing. So when it comes to amyloid deposition, we think this is sort of, like you said, a reactive process to something that's going on. If the reactive process is something that's related to infection, there's a high potential, I think, that methylene blue can be involved in that aspect of things. The other aspect of it is that the mitochondrial dysfunction aspect that we mentioned before too. If the cells are under more stress, they're causing more inflammatory markers to be produced, more amyloid is going to go to those areas and try to protect the tissue as you described it. And so if we can work on the mitochondria itself and see how methylene blue can compensate and regenerate and make more efficient those mitochondria in the cells, those cells are not going to be producing a lot of those inflammatory cytokines and mediators that are causing the amyloid to potentially deposit on its own. And so the beautiful thing about methylene blue is that it can compensate for any dysfunction in the mitochondria itself. It can act just like oxygen as well. So even if you don't have enough oxygen around, you can actually use methylene blue as a final electron acceptor in the mitochondria to make more energy. There's a really great researcher. I'm not sure if you ran into his stuff when you were looking at methylene blue, but his name is Francisco Gonzalez Lima, and he is a
yes,
nice
FGM. Yes, we've actually spoken and exchanged emails.
Nice. Yeah. So he's done a lot of the research at the University of Texas, Austin, looking at, what he would call Alzheimer's models in animals, and then using methylene blue as a way to regenerate their tissue and seeing these amyloid plaques and other things improve, also seeing signs of mitochondrial efficiency improve, and seeing their cognitive function in these animals improve as well. And what he often would talk about is something called like a blood flow issue, where oftentimes in a lot of this tissue, you're not getting a lot of blood flow into the area because of the deterioration, the inflammation, the vascular deterioration itself. But what you can use while you're using methylene blue, you're actually, you're decreasing inflammation, you're reversing a lot of this sort of pathology, and you're seeing improvements in ATP and production of more efficient mitochondria in the cells that have been damaged or deteriorating because of this particular disease.
And now we're at a rate of, now we're talking, we are damaging our cells with in so many different ways. Quite recently, the first ever study was revealed out of Australia, and what it showed was that the human brain tissue now contains, on average, 0.5% of plastic in weight. And this is due to the amount of microplastics that have been broken down from packaging and plastic bottles and from the air in our environment. And this particular study from the University of Sydney Brain Bank, they showed in humans that the PFAS was long-chain PFAS were going in and binding to the brain cell membrane, and it was accumulating there. And I just think to myself, well, that's just inviting the brain to a whole range of inflammatory cascades to occur. Not just that, then we're also stressed. I live in New York City, as I mentioned, so I fly back and forth from LA and New York. So there's just so much happening in my body right now. So who knows? I'm actually going to measure my amyloid when I go back to LA with the new amyloid blood tests that we can do. So this can definitely help me counteract that. You mentioned the word oxygen, and I'd be remiss if I didn't speak about what I believe was your first real interest and love, which was hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
True.
Still, yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know if we're too early. I mean, I go into one. I love it. I don't actually know too much about the science of it. But the reason I bring it up is because there is a video that is circulating and going viral right now of RFK on an aeroplane putting methylene blue drops in his, in his water or in his mug. Right. Did you see that?
Of course, yes.
Of course you did.
Yeah.
So why don't we explain something that happens in the air in terms of air pressure and oxygen?
Sure. So I guess we can start with an airplane first, because it's actually the opposite of a hyperbaric chamber. A airplane is a hypobaric, Hypo-baric chamber. So when you're traveling on an airplane, typical airplanes are pressurized to about 8,000 feet above sea level. This makes them lighter. That's why they can fly easier. They use less gas. If you're super, super rich, you get a plane that is pressurized to sea level, because you'll get as much oxygen at sea level when you're on an airplane. That will make you feel less jet lagged when you get to your destination, because Typically, we're at sea level. You're at sea level in New York and LA. I live in Colorado, so I'm about 5,000 feet up. So positive thing about living in Colorado, there's many things, but one of them is your jet lag is better because you're already at 5,000 feet. So going on an airplane at 8,000 feet is not a huge hypoxic stress compared to being at sea level and going to 8,000 feet on an airplane. And that's a significant hypoxic stress. So on a airplane, you are in a hypobaric environment. You have less oxygen around. And this is actually why methylene blue can be so helpful in these kinds of situations. I have all of my patients, all of my friends and family, whenever they're coming to Colorado or if they're traveling on an airplane in general, I have them on a methylene blue protocol because it protects their cells. It actually protects them from those low oxygen conditions by allowing them to utilize methylene blue as a source of something like oxygen to help you make energy. It also prevents you from getting some of the radiation damage as well, because being closer to the sun, less atmosphere, you have more radiation exposure when you're in an airplane. Of course, you're also subject to poor air, poor light, and lots of people with lots of different things from around the world, which can always be fun too. So methylene blue can support you in all these cases. And that's why I have significant protocols where I use methylene blue pre-treatment, pre-flight, during flight. When you get to your destination, it can be really, really great. If you're interested, there's a lot more information on that. So that's a hypobaric environment, and why RFK was using it on an airplane.
What's the percentage of oxygen in a plane?
So you're 21% oxygen at sea level. So the most of the rest of the air that you're breathing in New York City, you might have slightly more on the pollutant side, and LA for you on both ends of that. But in general, it's 21% oxygen and about the rest of it's mostly nitrogen. And then in addition to that, you have all the smaller gases, including the fun ones when you live in bigger cities. When you're on an airplane at 8,000 feet, you have in essence about 16%, 15% oxygen in the air that you're breathing. So that's a significant decrease in the amount of oxygen you're breathing for a short period of time. And this is why a lot of people will complain of feeling terrible when they get to the destination. Of course, you're on an airplane, you might be changing time zones and all that included, but in addition to that, a big stress is the hypoxic stress. So if you want less jet lag, you can come, live in Colorado or a mountainous area. You're going to feel better when you go destinations. That's something I didn't realize. I lived in California, Northern California for many years, and my jet lag is so much better living in Colorado as opposed to living when I lived on the coast overall. So that's a hypobaric environment, and RFK was using methylene blue on an airplane because of those reasons and because it's protecting it from all those things. Now, a hyperbaric environment, HYPER, this is a high oxygen environment. This is an environment where you have more pressure, simulated the pressure you feel under a certain amount of seawater. If you dive underneath the ocean, you look up 15 feet, if you're 15 feet below, all that water above you is exerting a significant pressure on your body, okay? And that pressure will drive gases into the body at higher amounts, depending on what those gases are. So in this case, we're talking about oxygen. So you have more oxygen, you can drive more oxygen in circulation. And as a result of that, you can create not only oxygen, an increased oxygen stimulus, not only on the red blood cells, which typically carry oxygen, but also in the plasma or the liquid of the bloodstream. And you can get up to 1,200% more oxygen in circulation this way, which can be fantastically beneficial for many different things. But the key here, Louisa, to understand, and like the reflection for me, is that I realized very early on, because I've been involved in hyperbaric medicine for over a decade, is that if people went into the chamber and they were not well optimized beforehand, especially to deeper pressures, they would feel terrible or not get the results that they were supposed to hypothetically get by going into a chamber. And that's because when you're giving so much oxygen to the system has to be able to make energy from that oxygen and also has to be able to detox from the energy that you make. Because when you make energy, as we were alluding to earlier, you need to be able to detox or neutralize that oxidative stress that happens with all that energy that you make. And so this is where I got an interest in energy metabolism, how well people can make energy, how well people can detox from the energy that they make. Both are absolutely essential. So how well can you take your macronutrients and how optimized are your vitamins, minerals, your cofactors, your nutrient elements, et cetera, to allow you to make energy. And then at the same time, how well you optimize to do the detoxification side of things too. And so in 2017, I met a fantastically smart physician named Dr. Ted Tricoso, who gave me a foundation to really understand this in a nonprofit that we incorporated that year called Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, or Home Hope for short. And that nonprofit trains practitioners like me and unlicensed or non-licensed practitioners as well, how to work with clients to help optimize their health rather than focusing on disease, and doing it in a 7-module certification for any type of practitioner, which is something that I do in clinical practice. The key for me, my in there, was energy metabolism. And the key for us when we started a for-profit company to go alongside the nonprofit called Transcriptions was, how can we help people right now while they're on the longer path of optimizing their health, which can take a long time for some people. And methylene blue was the first compound that actually Dr. Ted found in the literature showing all these mitochondrial benefits. And that's why we decided to use it in clinical practice, use it in commercial products. And I use it all the time in my clinical practice of how I think about utilizing hyperbaric therapy, but always thinking about how well can somebody optimize their energy production and detoxification. And methylene blue can help on both of those sides.
Wow, I didn't know that about Hyperbaric, that it's better to be optimized prior to going in. I'm actually going to use it tomorrow. I do know that I think it's phenomenal, especially for post-stroke patients within the first 24 to 48 hours. Amazing, because obviously they're hypoxic. And then if you're recovering from surgery or from an injury, I don't know what the efficacy is of just doing it daily just to feel better. I mean, it sounds, in theory, it does sound like, oh, of course, who wouldn't want to live in a land with 1,200% more oxygen? So it does sound great.
Yes, but no, right? Because we were just discussing here, right? So like, a lot of oxygen is not always a good thing. Some oxygen can be good sometimes. So you definitely don't want to be in a hyperbaric chamber all the time, for sure. And a lot of it also depends on the level of hyperbaric therapy you're doing, like how much pressure, how much oxygen, and what your goals are over the time. And so I've been doing it a long time. Mild units tend to be very benign overall. People tend to do okay, even if they're relatively not well optimized. But if you have a chronic condition or you have a long-term goal, the real key is to optimize before you go into a chamber. And that's really what is the most important in my practice. If you have an acute issue, like an acute stroke, like you mentioned, acute heart attack, traumatic brain injury, go to the hospital, do what you got to do, and then get into a hyperbaric chamber as soon as possible. But I'm using a ton of methylene blue in these cases as well, because methylene blue is a mitochondrial rescue. It has actually been shown in stroke, in traumatic brain injury, that you can rescue brain tissue by using methylene blue in the acute period. Now, this is in animals. It hasn't been studied in humans as much. The beautiful thing about, and the terrible thing about methylene blue is that it's been around for as long as it has been. So there's not a lot of interest on the pharmaceutical side or study side for research and funding to do these kinds of things. But in animals, methylene blue rescues mitochondrial function. It rescues brain cells. And so all of my patients have a higher strength methylene blue version of one of the products that we have in their medicine cabinets in case anything goes wrong, in case they have an acute trauma, acute stress, if they have an acute ischemic event, God forbid. Of course, you're going to take your regular stuff, like take your aspirin and go to the hospital. But if you have this on board, I'll use 2 or 3 milligrams per kilogram times 1 or 2 doses, because that's the studies that's the study dosing that they've seen for these more acute things, where for more chronic issues or more chronic mitochondrial stress, brain fog, your cognitive impairments, your issues with concentration, much lower doses of methylene blue, 4, 8, 12, 16 milligrams can go a long way from a mitochondrial efficiency perspective. And those are doses that I mostly use. I mostly use the lower doses, and I don't really use a lot of the higher doses unless it's more of an acute issue, like acute infection, acute trauma, those kinds of things. Like a good example is like my mom, who lives in New York, was bitten by a tick maybe 6 months ago now. And, New York has lots of ticks, and Lyme is not a small thing. And so I gave her 2 milligrams per kilogram of methylene blue for 3 to 5 days. She felt fantastic. Like, this is the greatest thing that's ever been discovered. Like, she felt amazing. And now she's like one of my biggest fans of methylene blue. I'm telling all her friends about it. But she did take antibiotics at the same time too. She was worried, and that was totally okay. In some cases, I think that's appropriate. Other cases, like for example, I've used high doses of methylene blue in urinary tract infections in very compliant and very cooperative individuals where I can watch them for 2 to 3 days to see how they do before they start antibiotics, for example. Those kinds of things.
Your blood work is the roadmap to optimizing performance and longevity. I don't care what anybody says. You have to start there. That's why I work with Hone Health to track my testosterone, my DHEA, and other critical hormonal biomarkers, because knowing your numbers lets you dial in your protocols with precision. If you're looking to optimize hormone health, increase energy, and feel your best, don't guess. Test. Hone Health makes it easy with an at-home test and expert guidance to help you take action on your results. Studies actually indicate that maintaining optimal testosterone and DHE levels, even in females, can improve metabolic function, support cognitive performance, and enhance overall vitality. And team, I'm talking from experience. If you are a female or a male, but especially the women, because obviously I'm a female, go and do this test. If you're in your mid-30s and above, I urge you to go and do the Hone Health at-home blood test, because let me tell you, it will pay dividends in your health, your vitality, your mood, and everything else. So just go to honehealth.com to get started and take control of your health today.
The moment that we've all been waiting for, I want to talk about bioavailability. What I've seen is drops. That's what RFK was using. I've seen methylene blue IVs. That's when you put a needle in your vein and it goes straight into your veins. And then you've got these little tabs that you sent me, actually, and it's the only type of methylene blue I've had. And this little tab you stick between your gum and your cheek, and it kind of dissolves over time. Now, the ones that you sent, the little squares, I had 2 of those squares.
Did you have, it comes in what's called a buccal troche. So the troche is a dissolvable lozenge. It looks like it's like a square like this.
It's a quadrant. Yes.
It's a quadrant. That's a good way to describe it. A quadrant.
I cut it in half.
Yeah, you cut that in half. So you had a half of this. So
I had half, yes.
Yeah. So when it comes to bioavailability, the very interesting thing is that, most things are degraded after we take them by mouth, like especially supplements, but even our food it goes through our stomach, it goes through our intestines and then our liver, and it gets processed, as it were. So a good example of this that I often use is something called NAC, or N-acetylcysteine. NAC is about 10% bioavailable, which means if you take it orally, say you take 100 milligrams of it, only about 10 milligrams of that gets into the body. That's because it goes through the stomach, the small intestines, the liver, etc. Methylene blue is just about 100% bioavailable, no matter whether you get it IV, you take it as a troche, or if you swallow it. The difference is going to be how fast it gets into the system. Now, IV is obviously going to be the fastest, obviously. A troche is going to be your second fastest, and swallowing it's going to be your third. So the thing about a troche that's very interesting is that troches, the way we designed the products and the why we decided on troches is that troches have that quadrant capacities, as you saw. So you can easily titrate your dose. You can start off with a quarter, then go to a half and full. And oftentimes when you're starting something like methylene blue, that can be very, very helpful, especially for going through a lot of tough times and you have chronic issues with inflammation, infection, chronic complex medical illness. Like you really want to start slow with your dosing and increase your dose over time to see what works best for you. And so titration is nice for that reason. Buccal is very interesting. So buccal between your upper cheek and gum, the lozenge there, it bypasses metabolism in the liver. So it bypasses that digestion and bioavailability issue. That's not an issue for methylene blue, as we just described, but for many, many things, it is. And so as a result of bypassing, it will retain bioavailability. And as a result of being buccally absorbed, it works faster. So we've designed ours to be troches because they're titratable, they work faster. But if you don't want a blue mouth, you can also swallow the methylene blue as well and get the same mitochondrial effects. Yeah, you can. But the key with that is to swallow it on an empty stomach and also to wait to eat about until 15 to 20 minutes later. Now, there is a caveat to that. If you have more brain-related symptoms, if you have cognitive issues, people that take it and have it as a buccal lozenge will feel it faster. And often, and a lot of my patients swear by taking it buccally as a result of having that more cognitive bump faster as a result. The troche is also stable. Liquids are unstable overall. Every liquid methylene blue that we tried and tested did not meet the label claim of the milligram dosage that it had on there, meaning that if it said it was 1 milligram per ml or something like that, it was typically 80% of that or less compared to what it said on the label. So liquid is unstable, and none of the ones that we tested met label claim, I think, except for maybe one of the companies. And liquid also tends to be potentially higher risk for having things like heavy metals in it as well. There's something called USP grade methylene blue, which is what we have and what many other companies say that they have. But even USP grade, which is pharmaceutical grade, can be contaminated with heavy metals at times. And it's a significant issue. And when we first started the company, Louisa, it took us another 18 months to launch because we needed to find good sources of methylene blue. So your source matters. Liquid, I think should be avoided overall because of the potency issue mostly. And then liquid's actually even messier because it can get everywhere. You have to be super careful of it. And so, for example, if RFK did a drop of his methylene blue on the airplane some other place, it would never come out. The antidote for that, the antidote for methylene blue on furniture or on surfaces is actually buffered vitamin C. And so my marriage has been saved at least twice, maybe 3 times now, because of having
methylene blue on the couch
around. Yeah, you need to have buffered vitamin C around, especially because it does stain. It will stain everything if you're not careful.
In terms of kilograms, you mentioned that earlier. I weigh 65 kilos. I don't know what that is in pounds. I still work on the metric system.
135 pounds or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, great. So then what does that mean for me in terms of dosages of this one specifically that we mentioned?
So there's two basically way to think of dosing is you have a low dose and you have more of a high dose. And then you have a super high dose of methylene blue. So the low doses, 4, 8, 16 milligrams, 25 milligrams, these are more doses for mitochondrial support. They're helping with energy production. They're helping with detoxification. So they can improve mitochondrial efficiency. They can clean up your mitochondria. They can regenerate your mitochondria. They can create new mitochondria at these doses. And so for most people, those are the doses that work the best for the reasons that they're looking to use methylene blue. Now, if you're just starting methylene blue, as I was alluding to earlier, usually I have people starting off at 4 or 8 milligrams, then titrating their dose, let me just be clear there, increasing their dose every 3 to 5 days until they find the dose that seems to work best for them. And that could be more energy, that could be better cognition, that could be a better mood, that could be all of the above. But I mean, Louisa, I was just floored when we first started this company because this textile dye, and I was getting these stories from these people saying that they had tried everything. And then finally methylene blue was the only thing that got them back to work, that got their pain better, that allowed them to pick up their kids again, ridiculous things. And I was like, this is just amazing. And so a lot of the published literature, though, has people taking more than 1 milligram per kilogram. So that for you would be around 65 or 70 milligrams. So those doses in our experience, and also in the research, if you look at it, there was one study on Alzheimer's specifically, I don't know if you saw this, but they gave 3 doses of methylene blue to Alzheimer's patients, 8 milligrams twice a day, 75 milligrams twice a day, and 150 milligrams twice a day. Okay. And so the 8 milligrams twice a day was the placebo, was the sham control, because one fun side effect that we haven't spoken about regarding methylene blue is that it concentrates in your urine and you will have blue urine. Yes. When you take it. So don't be surprised. It's okay. It's just because of methylene blue. Now, in this study, in the 3 different, the 2 different arms and the placebo, or the sham or the placebo group did much better than the 2 groups that got the higher doses. And the reason for this, as far as I'm concerned, is that the higher doses, not only do they help with the sort of redox on the methylene, on the mitochondria itself, but they also cause more stress on the system, causing increase in hydrogen peroxide production. And when you do that, the body is trying to respond by increasing the amount of antioxidants around, and specifically glutathione. So if you're glutathione deficient and you're taking higher doses of methylene blue, especially for a longer period of time, you're going to see potential detrimental effects in somebody's brain that's already under stress. If you already have Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment, you're already going to have stress on the system. And so we looked at this literature and saw that 8 to 16 milligrams seemed to be a sweet spot, especially for neurocognitive things. And that's why we developed the dosing that we did. And we're really very different when it comes to a lot of the other methylene blue companies out there that are recommending much higher doses. But in my experience, it's not a good idea to start at those kinds of doses for chronic issues, mitochondrial support. For an acute issue, for sure. So if you came to me and said, I'm feeling like a viral infection's coming on, I would say, okay, at least 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram for 3 to 5 days, and then ramping down your dose from there is what I would be recommending for most of my, my particular patients. But for like most people, I don't go by the milligram per kilogram. I go by the low doses, and I increase over time.
And that's a consistent daily intake?
It depends on why people are using it. If they're using it for something more, chronic inflammatory issues, say they have an autoimmune problem, say they have long COVID, chronic EBV, mold toxicity, these are going to be things that aren't going to go away in a short period of time. My clinical practice is optimizing people over the long term. And the hope is, for a lot of clinicians, it'd be in the same boat. If you optimize a system, you can then, as a result of that, peel things off like your methylene blue support while you're doing the harder work of optimizing your diet, your lifestyle, your stress, your husband, or whatever, and then being able to optimize that, and then slowly weaning them off of the methylene blue. And so in those cases, sometimes it's 2 to 4 weeks that I'm keeping them on for every day, and other times it's 4 to 6 to 12 months until I can get them having more of that sustainable foundation as I'm working on that foundation of their health. In others, like in people that are more well optimized, that are using it more in a targeted way. So say for performance, we have tons of endurance athletes that are using methylene blue now because methylene blue optimizes the capacity to make energy from aerobic capacity for longer. So I've had marathon runners, ultra marathon runners using it, long distance sports, et cetera, using methylene blue. And then also targeted for more stress. Like I didn't sleep very well last night. Here's some methylene blue. I'm going on an airplane for the next week or two because I go back from New York and LA every week, and that's not good for my circadian health, right? So then I'm using more methylene blue, even if I'm relatively well optimized otherwise. So in essence, you can use it more in a targeted way, or you can use it more in a daily dosed way, especially at low doses, to see the benefit long-term as you're working on, hopefully, some of the foundational markers of your health, your diet, your lifestyle, your behavior, those kinds of things.
I couldn't imagine that it has any contraindications. For example, I'm thinking about giving it to somebody who's got ADHD, an extreme level. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I don't know how to explain that. And she's on Vyvanse. So I can't imagine that this would interact in a negative way with a pharmaceutical.
Well, you have to be careful always, right? Because when you're using methylene blue, you are working on neurotransmitters and you are working on the metabolic activity of the cells themselves. So you always want to be careful when you're starting methylene blue, when you're on any psychotropic medications, any medications that are enhancing or having effect on neurotransmitter balance. So, for example, one of the big areas that we look at is that anybody that's on an SSRI or SNRI that's taking methylene blue or thinking about taking methylene blue has to do it, we would recommend with a practitioner, because these SSRIs and SNRIs are increasing the amount of serotonin and norepinephrine around already, and then you're on methylene blue, which also is going to do the same thing. But it does it at milder, but the combination is usually fine. It's usually not an issue, especially if you're doing very low doses of methylene blue, but it can make people feel a little strange, a little bit different. And so it's important to make sure that you're being monitored. On the other end of that, I'm working with integrative psychiatrists that are weaning their patients off of SSRIs and SNRIs for depression and using methylene blue instead, because we know that depression is not a serotonin deficiency. That's something that's come out over the last couple of years, as you probably know. So in your ADHD patients specifically, I have used in combination our methylene blue with ADHD medications in my clinical practice. I do it very slowly because you're increasing metabolic rate, you're increasing energy production. So you can sometimes see that you can see them having more energy overall. And so we have another product at Transcriptions called Blue Cannatine, which is a combination of methylene blue with nicotine, caffeine, and CBD.
Yes.
And
actually, that's what I've got currently in my hands.
Yeah.
Cannatine TX, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so blue cannatine was our first product that we came out with in 2020. And this is like,
Not to be confused with cigarettes.
so yeah, we can talk about nicotine
Tobacco.
briefly, but in general, this product is our focused productivity, get shit done for 3 to 5 hours. It's like taking a stimulant without the come down and the crash. And we developed it this way because we wanted an alternative to those kinds of things. And methylene blue, we've already discussed, it's fantastically supportive. Energy production, the neurotransmitters. Nicotine itself is a fantastic cognitive enhancer as long as you don't smoke it, vape it, and keep the dose less than 4 milligrams per day. And smoking and vaping have their own additives inside of those products that increase the addictive capacity of nicotine. And vaping nicotine itself, has all those additives in there. Nicotine itself, though, has been studied, as you likely know, in Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. It increases cognitive performance, energy overall in the brain. So you have better memory, you have better recall, you have better executive function. And so nicotine is fantastic as long as you keep it extremely low dose compared to a cigarette, which has about 26 milligrams of nicotine per cigarette, along with the additives. You have something like blue cannatine has 1 milligram of nicotine in there in total, in that full trochee, all 4 quadrants of the trochee, as you said. And so my dose of that is 1/4 because I don't drink very much caffeine and I don't have very much nicotine otherwise. And so, but this combination, I've been able to use this particular product to wean patients off other Adderalls and Vyvanses of the world slowly and with practitioner support. So I don't recommend anybody do it without practitioner support. But what I'll typically do is have my patients start it blue cannatine on a weekend, find the dose that works for them, and then that's the dose that they use, instead of their ADHD meds. What I'll often do also, Louisa, is I'll do them a combination where I'll have them take the blue cannatine in the morning instead of their stimulant, with my supervision. And then in the afternoon, they'll take the pure methylene blue, or just blue, our low dose methylene blue, pure, which is, at 8, 12, 16 milligrams, something like that. And they're able to maintain their energy without having the stimulation as a result of not having the caffeine or nicotine in the product. And so we call it the GSD, the Get Shit Done bundle, or the Get Shit Done day, is you have your blue cannatine in the morning, you're just blue in the early afternoon, and you're good to go. You rock and roll all day long.
It sounds like modafinil or provisional.
So
to an extent.
Yes. So in the sense that you will feel more wakeful, you'll get more shit done.
Yeah.
And I like Provigil. I think it's a great drug. It actually gives me headaches. It's too dopaminergic for me overall. So, and it actually increases people's blood pressure as well. So you have to be careful there. But Provigil, it gives you more wakefulness, but it doesn't give you attentiveness per se. And so for some people it does, some people it doesn't. But again, that's a pharmaceutical. It's hard to get, and it's also what's it called? It's scheduled, is just like Adderall is. And there's been an issue with Adderall and supply lately as well. So, and there's more of an interest because people that take Adderall do not like taking Adderall most of the time. They don't like that they don't eat, they can't sleep, that they get bad crashes. And so blue cannatine was really developed as a way
speed.
as a way to increase your focus, your productivity for 3 to 5 hours without a come down, without a crash. Methylene blue is supportive. CBD in there is supportive as well. And then, CBD is going to have an anti-inflammatory capacity. So everything that we formulate, Louisa, is always on the guise of, we don't want to just clock the system. We don't want to just give you something to feel better for a short period of time. We're looking at making you feel better and then help regenerating the system over time, or supporting the system over time. Especially the products that we develop are all developed that way, everything that we make. So it's not just about making you feel better for 3 to 5 hours. It's making sure that your system is supported for those 3 to 5 hours. So you're not clocking it along the way. That's a big thing.
Well, I'm excited I'm so happy that we were able to do this. We really went deep on the mechanism of action of methylene blue, and we discussed different disease states and pathology. And so far, I'm loving it. I'm going to start. I got to be honest, I haven't been doing it daily, but it's something that I'm going to start doing more effectively.
When you're traveling, especially when you're traveling, when you're going back and forth. Yeah, that's a big one. I use about 4 milligrams a day typically, or 4 milligrams every other day, which is pretty low dose. But when I travel, I'm up to 8 to 16 milligrams per day. And I use that in combination with another product that we have at Transcriptions called Tromune, which is a high strength version of the cordyceps mushroom called cordycepin, which is a fantastic anti-inflammatory. It's an immune system modulator. It's also an antiviral. So my combination personally, and for a lot of my patients as well, is a combination of the methylene blue during the day, the Just Blue that we have, and then our Tromune at night, which is, I have 4 children at my house, and I very rarely get sick now, even though I travel every month for conferences and all that craziness and speaking and everything else. So there are ways that we can support ourselves and our patients and our families, even though we don't live in a natural world. We can do things about that.
Well, I'm super excited to see what the potential of this is ongoing, and the number of studies that you're going to be in, especially in the reproductive world. So I think that we'll have to definitely do a part 2, and you and I will definitely stay in contact. So are you on socials? Where can people find out more about the company and more information on methylene blue?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we were the first company that came out with a methylene blue containing product in 2020. There are 4 doctors on my team, including me. There are no other companies out there that have as much longevity in the world of talking about methylene blue. So if you go to our blog at transcriptions.com and you look at our blogs on methylene blue, we've been making these since 2020. So a lot of articles there, a lot of research for you to dig into, everything from the things we discussed here to other kinds of things like musculoskeletal performance and more. You can find on our blog. So you can go to transcriptions and transcriptions.com. Also on Instagram at transcriptions as well, where you can find more information in short form as we have over there. There's also my personal Instagram at Dr. Scott Sherr, DrScottSherr. You can find out more about what I do in clinical practice. We also have a nonprofit organization, as I was alluding to earlier, called Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, or Home Hope for short. This is what started this whole transcriptions journey. In 2017, we incorporated the nonprofit. We train practitioners. So if you're if you're a practitioner listening, you don't have to be licensed, working as a health coach or whatever. If you're working with people and want to have a foundation for what you do, Health Optimization Medicine and Practice could be that foundation. We optimize health rather than treat disease. We reverse all your markers, nutrient, gut, hormones, everything to when you were 21 to 30 years of age. And we have created the first standard of care for health, not disease, which is very, very exciting. But that's where Transcriptions came from. And so we wanted Transcriptions to be a company that can help people right now while they're on the longer path to optimizing their health. And so if you're interested in health optimization medicine and practice, you can go to homehope.org. You can check it out. We also have a list of practitioners that can help you around the country. And if you are a practitioner, you can sign up for training there too, if you're interested.
I love that, Dr. Scott. Thank you so much for being part of the Neuro Experience podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Louisa.